Thank you very much for coming. Welcome. I'm Paul Whalen. I'm from the Camas Valley History Group. I want to welcome you to the latest of our quarterly presentations on history of Camas Valley. Before we start, I want to draw your attention to the boards over there. They're the timeline of events that led up to the new becoming a state. We also had images of the mayors of Camas Valley, at least those that we could find. If you have photographs or any information on, particularly Francis, we'd really love to hear it. It's a bit of a gap. Joe will talk about the attempt to try and gather this information a little bit later, but we have a few people we want to thank. And as always, we operate as a team, so we're grateful to everybody that's contributed. We've drawn on family stories, newspapers, and genealogical records. We've tried to be as accurate as possible, but as you can imagine, mistakes will get there somewhere, and if we missed anything, apologise, and if you can help us, that would be great. I'm obviously looking at Steve, whatever it is. We start at the end of the presentation for questions, and answer any of those questions. This talk is an evolution of the governance in the valley, starting with a theocratic government, gradually evolving to a more democratic civil government. To reassure you, there couldn't be any boring civic lessons people telling you about. But from your high school years, I want to begin with a couple of quotes from someone very familiar, perhaps, who had a lot to say about government. One of his famous phrases, "This government is not the solution, rather it is the cause of our problems." This is one of my favourites. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language. I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And then, less well known, but I think equally more apt phrase when you think of government. Well, Reagan said, if it moves, tax it. If it moves, it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving altogether, subsidise it. But without good government, we'll either have anarchy or perhaps even worse, overbearing totalitarian government. Today, we'll look at how governance has developed in the Camas Valley. We mentioned theocratic, and Deb will help define that a little bit later. But for the moment, I just want to mention something that Ronald Reagan said about the importance of God to our nation. We never forget we are one nation under one God, and we will be a nation gone under. I think that kind of sums up how he felt about the importance of all of the aspects of governance. That governance begins in our hearts, and perhaps that's where God enters it most. For all his wit and sarcasm, there's an element of advice in how we would have perceived our government and those who would govern us. Our reason for bringing you this presentation is to show how we got here today, reflect on the importance of public service and our gratitude to all of those who humbly volunteer to serve like this, ladies and gentlemen on the board. And yet it brought us to where we are today. But before I go, two of my personal favourites that sit on my desk in my office, which mean a lot to me about what it means to serve. It can be done, and there is no limit or to the amount of good you can do or where you can go if you don't mind who gets the credit. And with that, I'll hand over to Deb.
Thanks, Paul. Can you hear me now? Okay. Welcome to the Camas Valley Historical History Group presentation. Today we want to acknowledge our dedicated civic leaders who have served our community and state for years. For the sake of consistency and shorter syllables, I'm going to refer to the church and the church members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, of which we are going to talk a lot about, as Mormons. And I do so, my intent is for simplicity and not to disrespect or offend. But for the purpose of this, What's that? Thank you. Thank you, Booker. All right. Because we are the Camas Valley History Group, and of course, we will focus on the unique history and foundation of civic leaders in Utah and the Valley. We use the word unique because there is no other state in the Union that functioned completely as a theocracy. We will look at the evolution of this form of government in the territory and state, and specifically Camas Valley. The ultimate goal of self-government gradually evolved from theocracy, in other words, the kingdom of God on earth, into an attempt to become fully integrated as Americans. The Utah pioneers postponed the establishment of a civil government until the foundations of a settlement had been laid permanently. In fact, there was no immediate need for a civil government since the entire population was Mormon, and the organization and institutions of the church met all governmental requirements. This graphic is nice, smooth, and this graphic is a nice, smooth, gradual evolution from theocracy to democracy of today. However, in reality, it was not always smooth. Not always smooth at all. So, basically, theocracy is a government run by religious leaders. It claims to be directed by God. And why did Utah have it? Because it was already in place and functioning when the Mormons arrived in Utah. This represented a complete fusion of church and state, the utilization of one set of institutions for both ecclesiastical and civic affairs. When the Mormon pioneers came to what would become Utah, they had been governed under this form of government within their insular community for the last 17 years. It worked well for them. Quick backstory. As a review of what most of you already know, the Mormons had been run out of several states in the Midwest, and after years of violence and hatred, as a group, they decided to find a place of their own. Today, the people of Utah could be considered some of the most country-loving and patriotic citizens in the Union. Not back then. With attacks and hate crimes carried out by some politicians and citizens, the Mormons decided flight was a better choice than fight. The frontier of Mexico offered a perfect opportunity to build an independent, isolated community, avoiding the competition that had led to their eviction from every previous gathering place. When it was all said and done in 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad started transporting people west, this was the result. 60,000 pioneers, 1,300 miles traveled. The reason that this group of people succeeded was cooperation, consensus, and a united belief, which was not evident in other, like on the Oregon Trail, people coming basically for themselves and to make money and better livelihood. And the governing principles was theocracy, which existed at the time. The quest for self-government and autonomy, I call it just leave us alone and let us practice our religion and live our lives, was a major priority for the Mormons. And settling in a region governed by Mexico seemed like a really good idea. As luck would have it, in 1864, Mexico sold the 500,000 square miles of land to the United States. After only 1 year, they were again living in the land they had tried to flee. When Congress failed to organize territories for them, each region formed its own provisional government. The state of Deseret was formed and claimed an immense area far beyond what was settled or even explored by the Mormons. The Deseret government operated over a year with a legislature, courts, and county governments. In the 1850 session of Congress, they divided the area into territories, granting Utah all of the Mormon settled area. So this map shows you where the Mormons had gone to settle. And New Mexico territory was given to that group of people. The U.S. government was now involved. So the first 2 years in Utah, before the state of Deseret was formed, Salt Lake City was where everybody went and where everything happened for the first couple of years. And it was a pure theocracy. For the lawmaking body, there was the High Council of the Salt Lake State. The courts were the established ecclesiastical tribunals, namely the bishop, the High Council, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and the First Presidency. For law executing arm, it was the Nauvoo Legion, named after their militia back in Illinois. In December 1847, the electorate of Salt Lake City voted to, quote, entrust complete jurisdiction over municipal affairs to the High Council, which acted as the first governing body until the provisional state of Deseret was established in 1849. The functions of that first government, functioning under pure theocracy, they divided the area that they were living in into 19 wards. And to my knowledge, those 19 wards and their boundaries still exist. In fact, before I moved to Camas, I lived in the 17th ward right up there that you can see. Not that that makes any difference, but they still exist. They not only divided the city into wards, they selected and assigned people for farming. They issued building permits, the felling of trees, granting license to control streams and to build sawmills, and every other civic matter. Now, how was justice carried out in early Utah? John Neberker is a useful source on early justice in Utah. He was elected as Utah's first public complainer. Don't you just love that job? I could do that job. In his memoir, he remembered, having no jails, we instituted a whipping post, which was the bell post, a pole on which a public bell was hung to call people together. It was the place designated for whipping. It's the Nauvoo bell. The bell was the Nauvoo temple bell brought to Salt Lake City in September of 1847 and mounted on a post in the first log and adobe fort, what is now Pioneer Park. But again, according to Neberker, quote, I had to chastise one in that way for stealing, but there was very little of this. However, not one robber. In this article, this is just an excerpt from the article, from the Deseret News, October 1850, that corroborates that. The writer is humble bragging that there is not a single crime in Deseret that year's court session. So if you can imagine, in Salt Lake City for one whole year, could not raise a case in a city of near 10,000 inhabitants, not one robber, thief, burglar, murderer, not one man in chains could be found, not one culprit of any description, not one trial could be had, not one decision could be given. Sounds like a pretty nice place to live. Theocracy was not intended to be permanent. The fact that the United States had failed to provide any form of government for the inhabitants of Utah was sufficient reason for the establishment of the state of Deseret. The Constitution of the state of Deseret was adopted by delegates in convention March 10, 1849. The limits of the proposed state were indeed extensive. The total area embraced more than 500,000 square miles, which is about twice the size of Texas and almost equal in size to Alaska. So this state was a pretty big one. It provided for 2 legislative houses and and House and Senate, and members of which were to hold office for 4 years. The executive power was vested in the governor, who was Brigham Young, and lieutenant governor and secretary of state and auditor. So they were setting it up at this time to mirror what other states were doing. The judicial power and vested Supreme Court and other inferior courts as the legislature might subscribe. The bishops of the 19 wards were elected magistrates. So immediately the wards were set up as like little municipalities. Okay, fun fact. Y'all know this. Deseret means honeybee, right? The honeybee is a common symbol of hard work, productivity, and self-reliance. Now, if you're familiar with Utah culture, and I am through my mother, who was born in 1918, this is what was the most important thing to those farmers down in Utah County and elsewhere, was hard work, productivity, and self-reliance. Everything else was secondary, I think. Now you know why half of the things in Utah are named after Deseret. That is why. We have a lot. To keep things in context, let's take a bird's eye view of key events leading to statehood, or in our case, events that contributed to the 47-year delay in achieving statehood. The first 10 years, the government claimed, the first 10 years is kind of what we've covered. There was the treaty with Mexico, Deseret. Plural marriage was announced in 1852, which will play a huge part in why we did not get statehood. We had the Utah War, where Johnston's army came in. Summit County was formed in 1852, but really didn't do anything until 1861. Camas Valley was settled around 1860-61. Polygamy, 10 years later, after it was announced, became illegal. The Republican Party slogan was "The twin relics of barbarism is slavery and polygamy," which at the time was a hot topic as well. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad came, and there was a large deluge of non-Mormon people that are called Gentiles. There were two political parties, the People's Party, which were the Mormons, and the Liberal Party, which was the Gentiles. And in 1870, before most states, or I think any states beside Wyoming, women got the right to vote in 1870. The priesthood was reorganized, which makes a difference in the structure of the theocracy in 1877. And Summit State was formed with North Summit, South Summit, and Park City. 87, the Edmunds-Tucker Act was anti-polygamy. All Utah women lose their right to vote. The 1890, the church is disenfranchised. The government came in and seized all of the church property except for local property. Because of that, a manifesto was announced by the leader of the church in 1990 that polygamy would no longer be tolerated within the church. And by golly, 6 years later, we become a state. So without me saying, you can kind of figure out why it took so long. Whereas California and Nevada, they were a state after applying for it once in 1864. And it's because they had a lot of gold and silver. So again, make the connection. The slow march to full statehood and democracy continued with many bumps along the way. Too many to cover here. There's a new graphic. Thank you, Kate. Finally, in 1850, the U.S. government got involved. The bill creating the territory was signed by President Millard Fillmore, who she took off, on September 9th. Oops, what happened? Sorry. September 9th, 1850, he appointed 10 territorial officials, including Brigham Young, which were 5 Mormon and 5 non-Mormon. Territorial Utah, while imitating other states and communities, originated some of its own legal customs. Newly settled areas continued to place civil power in the hands of ecclesiastical stake presidencies and high council. This ecclesiastical municipal council provided instant order for a community as well as an orderly transition to civil government. So even as we rolled into territorial law, the leaders were still ecclesiastical leaders. Continuing, you took that out. Yes? Yeah. Oh, sorry. And now I turn the time over to Kate. Sorry.
This is what I may find us.
Sorry. She's got a great part.
Sorry. Put my mic back on. So what about Summit County? So what about Summit County? The county was first defined in an act of the Utah legislature in 1854, carved out of Green River County. Initially, though, Summit was dependent on Salt Lake County for elections, revenue, and judicial purposes.
Speak louder.
I tell her that all the time.
Oh.
Thank you, Booker.
Thank you. Is that better? So, until 1861, when William P. Vance was appointed probate judge. The probate judge had jurisdiction in all civil and criminal affairs of the county, which meant that the county court became the basic unit of local government. Judge Vance appointed A.B. Williams, Jacob M. Truman, and William Hennifer as selectmen, and William H. Kimball as the first sheriff of Summit County. Jacob Micah Truman was one of those who had been sent to settle Peoria, so Camas Valley was part of Summit County's governance right from the start. One Ship was the first county seat, probably because of its central location. The county court was held in a log cabin, which actually still exists, although you will have to travel some distance beyond One Ship to go and see it now. It was sold in 2004 and dismantled. Here it is now, before being taken apart. And here it is now. It's called the Nixon Cabin, and you can actually stay in it in Nauvoo, $149 a night. Here are the probate judges of Summit County for the first 22 years. 2, Thomas Rhodes and Ward E. Pack, were from Camas. We'll come back to them in a moment. Both were also presiding elders in Sage Bottom and Rhodes Valley forts. And these are the Camas Valley selectmen for the same era. I'm going to focus on a few of them in more detail, but first, let's talk about what a selectman was. The role of selectman was a relic of the colonial era when men of good character were selected to ensure that fathers in the 13 colonies exercised, quotes, proper family government. In Utah County, county selectmen were charged to oversee the poor residing in the said county, take care and management of insane persons, and bind out orphan and vicious, idle, or vagrant children until they reach the age of legal majority. As well as welfare, the judge and selectmen had responsibilities for roads, bridges, herd grounds, timber, waterways, canyons, and irrigation. So anyone who wanted to conduct business in a county had to petition the court at some point. For example, here's a petition from James Woolstenhume to open a sawmill in 1868. And if the petitioner wanted to build a road or a bridge, the court usually allowed him to charge a toll in return for keeping the road in good condition. So here's another application from 1868 from a Mr. Brizzy, who wanted to put in a toll gate in One Ship, and I'm quoting, to get as much as I can as soon as possible. It's not recorded whether the petition was granted. Below selectmen was Justice of the Peace, who could administer oaths and conduct weddings and had jurisdiction over any matter in controversy, civil and criminal, under $100. The sheriff and constables were responsible for executing orders and processes of the court, as well as collecting fines. This cracks me up. From 1870, constables were made responsible for collecting and burying dead animals near public streets. And from 1890, they took over the duties of pound keeper. They could also pursue fugitives into other counties and states. One last interesting official is the fence viewer. He was tasked with inspecting new fences and settling disputes arising from trespass by livestock that had escaped enclosure. A lawful fence was 4.5 feet high, in good repair, consisting of rails, poles, boards, stones, or other material. The fence viewer was allowed to charge 25 cents per hour for his time. Thomas Fraser, this chap here, was elected Summit County fence viewer in 1864. Although he never lived in the valley, he was actually murdered in 1869, his grandson would become the first mayor of Oakley, as you will see over there. He's also the ancestor of our illustrious leader. Yes. We're lucky to have the original handwritten minutes of the Summit County Court, and they've been a valuable resource in preparing this talk. Here's one of the original records, a list of the Summit County officers from Precinct 5, Camas Valley, from 1861. And for those of us who can't read pioneer handwriting, here it is in a more legible format. What's interesting is the column of numbers next to each name. In order to run for office, the person had to post a bond. Just to be sure, another person had to provide a surety for the bond. So, for example, when James McCormick and John Turnbow ran for Justice of the Peace and Constable respectively, they acted as each other's guarantors. And incidentally, running for Justice of the Peace was a pricey undertaking. $1,000 in 1864 is equal to over $19,000 today. Right, now let's get personal. Summit County's first probate judge, William Vance, didn't stay very long, and Thomas Rhodes replaced him in 1862. Thomas was born in Boone's Fort, Kentucky, in 1875, where Thomas's grandfather was a friend of Daniel Boone. In 1846, at the behest of Brigham Young, Thomas set out with 200 companions, mostly family members, to explore the route to California. Here, Thomas and most of the men went to work for Captain Sutter, whose mill would be the site of the first discovery of gold 2 years later. When called back to Salt Lake City in 1849, Thomas brought with him several sacks of gold, the largest amount of gold that had been brought into the valley. He turned the gold over to Brigham Young, and in return was named treasurer of Salt Lake County in 1852. Then there's the legend of the mine. Well, sorry, we're going to leave that one for a future presentation. Let's just say that it was probably during his trips to the Lost Roads mine that Thomas Rhodes came upon Camas Prairie. He reported to Brigham Young that he'd killed bears there and he wished to settle. Camas Prairie was granted to him and to Brigham Young in 1856. He built a fort and a stockade, and when George Washington Smith and others returned in 1860, they found Thomas and his family living there. When the settlers moved into Rose Valley Fort in 1866, Thomas served as the presiding elder. However, he didn't get to stay in the valley. In 1868, Brigham Young called Thomas to undertake a mission to Minersville, when he died in 1869. Ward Eaton Pack became Summit County probate judge in 1880, having previously served as a selectman. He was born in Watertown, New York in 1834. His parents, John and Julia Ives Pack, were early settlers of Kirtland and Nauvoo. His father, John, is one of the names memorialized on the This Is the Place monument. Ward crossed the plains in the Heber's C. Kimball Company in 1848. It's not quite clear when he came to the valley, but he served as presiding elder in the Sage Bottom Fort from 1866 to 1868. Like his father, Ward was a polygamist. He had 4 wives and 21 children. His third wife, Laura Cravath, who will feature in a future presentation, was living in Camas in 1880. And his last wife, Selina Carpenter, was the daughter of John Sincere Carpenter, one of the earliest settlers of the valley. He served 3 missions to the Sandwich Islands, which are now called Hawaii, as well as the 1869 Eastern States Mission. In addition, he was also in the territorial legislature. He died in Vernal in 1907. Now for the selectmen. Jacob Micah Truman was Camas Valley's first selectman for Summit County, appointed by William Vance in 1861. He was born in Niagara, New York in 1825 to John Franklin and Martha Spencer Truman. The family moved to Canada and then Michigan. Jacob joined the church in 1845 in Nauvoo, and in 1846 he was amongst the first to join the Mormon Battalion, where he was assigned to break in new animals. After his release, he remained in California for a while, going up to Sutter's Fort for gold, before returning to Salt Lake City in 1848. In 1849, he married Elizabeth Boyce and settled in South Cottonwood. He supplemented his income by serving in the Nauvoo Legion or Utah Militia, where he rose to the rank of captain and finally commanded his own company. In 1856, Jacob took his second wife, Catherine Maxwell. He actually took a third wife as well, Julia Ardina Hales, in 1857, but that marriage was annulled. In 1860, he was called to settle Peoria and took Catherine with him, leaving Elizabeth in South Cottonwood. He was appointed as selectman of Summit County in 1861, but he didn't stay. In 1861, October, he was called to settle St. George, and he sold his home and farm in South Cottonwood. Catherine remained in Peoria for a while. She had brothers there who could help her. But eventually, he enlarged his house in St. George to accommodate both wives, and Catherine left Peoria to join him. In 1869, the Trumans were sent to Fort Hamlin, also known as Mountain Meadows, where he became a presiding elder. He died there in 1881. Owen Strong Lee was the next Summit County selectman from Camas Valley, elected in 1865. He was born in Comstock, Michigan in 1835 to Dr. Ezekiel and Elizabeth Strong Lee. He crossed the plains with his family in 1855 and settled in what was then called Holidayburg. His father planted the first apple and peach trees in Utah, and Oren helped with the orchards until 1854, when he enlisted in the Utah militia along with his neighbour, Adrian Miles. In 1859, he married Adrian's daughter, Sally Ann Miles. In around 1861, they were both sent to settle Peoria, along with Sally Ann's brother, Benjamin. In 1866-67, he served as a Minuteman in a cavalry unit under James McCormick in the Indian Wars. As well as being a selectman for 4 terms, he served as county assessor and superintendent of schools for Summit County and in the territorial legislature. In 1887, he moved to Willow Creek in Idaho, where he died in 1919. James Wollstonecraft took office as a selectman in 1874, putting up a bond of $2,000. He was born in Oldham, England in 1837. His father died when he was 6, and at 7, he was working in the Lancashire cotton factories. In 1849, his mother and her new husband emigrated with his younger siblings. James, who had gone to school at the Oldham Bluecoat School, followed 2 years later, crossing the plains in the Philip Delamere freight train in 1852. And if anybody knows their history, that's the train that brought the sugar processing plant to Sugar House. He married Mary Love Page in 1858 in Bountiful. And they had 2 children, but their son, Ryan Jimmy, died in 1863. And about the same time, Mary left Utah, taking their daughter with her. And James married Julie Marianne Duhamel. The family moved to Camas Valley in 1865, where James worked for Samuel Hoyt and Louis Smith, before opening that sawmill that we saw the permit for in 1868. In 1869, Mary Love Page came back, and James built homes for both of his wives on his land. And as a consequence, in November 1887, he was arrested, fined dollars. Okay, I know we're not in England. $65 and served 6 months in the Utah Penitentiary for unlawful cohabitation. Besides being a selectman, he also helped set up the North Camas School, and he was county commissioner for several years. And he died in Marion in 1914. Right, we saw James McCormick being voted in 1865, and the bond was, as we saw, $1,000. He was born in Janesville, Wisconsin in 1834. With his brothers, John and Patrick, he travelled west, probably heading to the California gold fields, but depending on which story you believe, they became stranded at Camp Scott near Fort Bridger in Wyoming. There's one story that says that the boys stopped at Ephraim Perkins' home in Bountiful for supplies, where James met Jemima Adeline Perkins. Whether that's true or not, his brothers went on to California without him, and James married Adeline and was baptized into the church in 1857. He enlisted in the US Volunteers Battalion in January 1858 and served until September 1858. And again, there was a family story that he was one of the locksmith company that was sent out to check on the advance of Johnson's army. The family was sent to Camas in 1865, where James served as a captain in the militia during the Indian Wars. He wasn't listed as being a cavalry captain, but his unit is listed as being a cavalry unit. Adeline died in 1869, and in 1870, James married Lucy Brown Burbage. As well as being a justice of the peace, he was also deputy sheriff and a pound keeper, and a Sunday school teacher, and he died in Camas in 1892.
What's that Sunday school?
And here is the other guy from that form. This is John Gillenry Turnbow. He was sworn in at the same time as James, putting up a bond of $500. He was born in 1833 in Hamburg, Alabama, the oldest child of Samuel and Sylvira Hart Turnbow. In 1845, according to the proclamation of the 12 Apostles, his father, Samuel, sold all that the family owned and moved them first to Nauvoo and then to Council Bluffs. And in February 1847, they left winter quarters in the Abraham O. Smoot Company. John saw service in Captain Lot Smith's cavalry company in the Echo Canyon War. And in 1860, he married Sarah Elizabeth Horn. They were called to settle Camas Valley in 1861, and where he claimed 100 acres right the way across from Rhodes Valley Fort north, and he bred cattle and dairy cows. And he died in 1907. And now I'm going to hand back to Deb.
But one thing that was not mentioned is that selectmen are now called county commissioners. You may have heard of that term before, but that's how they started out. All right, continuing with the unique theme of Utah, colonizing the state and surrounding states was something no other state did or even tried. Brigham Young, the leader and governor of the territory, systematically selected areas to settle and people to settle them. Not only were the people sent to the areas outside of Salt Lake City because there were just too many people in Salt Lake, there was also usually a purpose that would benefit the church as a whole. For example, Camas Valley was settled in 1860 and 61 primarily because it provided a good source of timber and grazing for cattle. It is also said that when a pioneer company carrying Scandinavian saints arrived in Salt Lake City, They were quickly sent to Peoa because Peoa seemed to the church leaders to resemble the saints' homeland. That was kind of random. Camas Valley was settlement number 91. Each settlement was sent a leader called a presiding elder and was governed by a combination of theocracy and civil democracy. There's Camas. This is a timeline of settlement of Camas Valley. In 1857, after exploring the valley 2 years before, Thomas Rhodes took a small group of men and built a stockade for his livestock as well as other dwellings. A small group of Mormons attempted to settle Peoa, but because of the Utah War in 1857, Rhodes and Peoa settlers abandoned the stockade and town. 3 years later, Peoa was resettled in 1860, followed by Camas Prairie in 1861, Marion in 63. 2 forts were built in 1866 as protection from hostile Native Americans in the area. Francis was settled around 1867 and Woodland and Oakley in 1868. In 10 short years, the communities making up Camas Valley were in place. Okay, every community in Utah had, with the exception of Park City and other mining towns, an ecclesiastical leader was chosen and sent to the communities to provide leadership and direction. These church leaders were the civic leaders and ran the town under the principle of theocracy. So did you catch that? The church leaders were the civil leaders for a long time. Along with what we expect today, ecclesiastical leaders were concerned with the spiritual welfare of community members. However, their responsibilities were much greater. Public welfare included overseeing the spiritual, political, and temporal economic well-being of community leaders. They were at the top. As you can see, there was an overlap with the duties of the selectmen of the county. Evidence shows that the tight-knit communities were primarily looked after by presiding elders and other church leaders and supplemented when needed by the county. The economy of Camas Valley and all of Utah was very different in the 1800s. There were no banks, there was no real currency, taxes were tithing. Did you catch that? You paid your tithing, not your taxes. A tithing house or bishop's storehouse was built in every city at the center of commerce, So it was a storehouse with corrals, bins. It was the bank. It was the welfare office. It was the employment office. It was the trading post, and it was the local meeting house. Every town had one. Also, we discovered in the records that when Brigham Young was really promoting having the members start cooperatives in 1868 to the 1880s, he really didn't want to trade with the non-Mormons. He thought that that was bad for the economy, so he wanted the Mormons to start co-ops. And we found evidence of mercantiles. There was a very prosperous cheese factory here run by John Pack, and then flax farming. Has any of you ever heard of the cooperative flax farming? And is flax grown in this valley anymore? Sorry? Grows wild. Okay, well, that's easy to take care of then. So, now back to my obsession with our tithing house. Every community had a tithing house. Camas Valley, as you know, if you've ever heard me open my mouth, has a tithing house. It is on 30 North Main Street. It is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, buildings still standing in Camas Valley. Most communities have turned their tithing houses into museums or other heritage site. This is a building that was the heart of Camas Valley. Church meetings were held there, and for years it was the Camas City offices from 1950s until the present building was built. There is even a jail in the basement with bars still visible on the south side. What are we doing to preserve this heritage, the heritage of our tithing house? Your guess is as good as mine. The city sold it to a developer. I'm just saying. Presiding elders, back to these busy guys. They were also in charge of the public works. They assigned land distribution, road building, approved permits for other businesses. They coordinated the water. And I have read that based on the community members' worthiness in the church, they were granted better or more water rights. That would go over like a lead balloon nowadays. They also mediated disputes. So this was definitely a full-time job. So who were these busy men? In Peoa, they were David Rideout. After 2 years, he left because he would rather prospect for gold. Abraham Marchant took the position, and Abraham later became bishop when Peoa Ward was established in 1877. Ola Peterson served as presiding elder for the Scandinavian settlers of the valley. So we had a Scandinavian branch, ward, something. And the services and songs were in Swedish. William G. Russell was the first presiding elder for Rhodes Valley. Willett Shave Harder, a school teacher from Colville, took over from him in 1867, and he was replaced by Samuel Atwood, who was also had jurisdiction over Peoa, Rockport, Wanship, and Parley's Park, which is now called Park City, and who became the Camas Ward bishop in 1877. He presided over the building of the tithing house and the first church in Camas. During the Indian Wars, Ward, Easton Pack, and Thomas Rhodes presided over the fort, Sage Bottom and Rhodes Valley Fort, respectively. And you'll notice that these two men that were over the fort, I don't know if it's just a coincidence, but you'll notice they were also leaders in the county and at the same time leaders in the community. Presiding elders in Marion and Francis and Woodland. Marion was called Morrill at the time. They were established later than Peoa. John Knox Lemon was the first presiding elder. Henry Moon was sent to Woodland in 1881 to become the first bishop, and Francis residents attended meetings in Woodland until 1899, when Francis Marion Lyman, an apostle, was sent to set up wards in Francis and Woodland. Oakley was dependent on Peoa's leadership until 1894, when it became a ward. This goal of self-government gradually evolved from theocracy, the kingdom of God on earth, into an attempt to become fully integrated as Americans. In 1896, that happened, and statehood was celebrated, even in Camas. Finally, shortly after the turn of the 20th century, towns in Camas Valley became incorporated, and mayors were elected. We'll now turn the time over to Joe to talk about those leaders.
So I'm going to cover the period of town incorporation and discuss some of the mayors of the cities in the valley. And as we mentioned at the first, we don't know all the mayors, especially in Francis. They had some record problems, so these are just
nicely.
The mayors we found information on, and then have passed away. We try not to talk about people that are still alive. So, the citizens of Camas submitted a petition to become an incorporated town with the Summit County Commissioners in early 1911. While the reason for incorporating is not spelled out in the application, the requirements are included in the commission minutes. A community had to have a minimum of 300 residents. A majority of the electors of the area had to sign the petition, and finally, the minutes set out who the commission was appointing as the first board of trustees for Camas, serving until the next regular election could take place in November of 1911. Those appointed were James O. Pack as mayor, which you've seen that last name before, A.H. McCormick, Merritt N. Pack Sr., Jesse R. Burbidge, and R.L. Keene as the board members. So James Orland Pack was the first mayor of Camas. He served basically 6 months and was appointed. He was born in Salt Lake City in 1868 and died in Camas in 1938. He was buried at Wasatch Lawn Memorial Park in Mill Creek. He married Zola Pack, which was his first cousin, in Camas in 1898. They had 6 children together, with 2 of them dying in childhood. All but one left the valley upon adulthood, and that son, Farrah M. Pack, stayed a bachelor and lived in Camas all or most of his life. Farrah. F-E-R-A, yes. So no direct descendants of James O. Pack remain in the valley. James was a farmer, and as you can see here, he was replaced by John C. Lambert after the first election, but John actually ended up dying about 6 months after taking office. I don't know.
Politics will kill you.
Yeah. Yes, okay. Dr. Thomas A. Dannenberg was the 6th mayor of Camas. He was born in Wise, Texas in 1880 and moved to Camas around 1910 after completing his training as a doctor in San Francisco. He married Maud Reynolds while he was in California for his schooling in 1905. Dr. Dannenberg became mayor somewhat circuitously. Merritt and Pack, another Pack, was elected as mayor in 1918. He resigned for reasons unknown, and Richard W. Barnes was appointed as mayor. Barnes resigned after a few months as he moved out of town to Farmington. Dannenberg was serving as mayor of the town, serving as a member of the town council, and was appointed to fill roughly 1.5 years of the remaining term, because at that time the local elections were every 2 years. He only served for 2 years. This was during a difficult time as America had just entered World War I, and young men were being drafted to serve in the military. Also, as a result of World War I, the so-called Spanish flu was ravaging communities across the world, even in our secluded valley. About 6 months into the pandemic, this article was published in the Park Record. It said, "Praise to our Dr. T.A. Dannenberg. Due to his wonderful work, together with the good people, the influenza epidemic has been entirely stamped out in the districts of Bench Creek, Woodland, Francis, Camas, and Marion. We have had no new cases for 3 weeks. At the present time, these districts are quarantined against all other towns. The roads are guarded day and night to prevent people from entering. In case important business calls anyone out of these towns, on returning they must be isolated for 4 days. We sincerely wish that all towns had as capable a doctor as the town of Camas." So next, we're going to talk about Sisson Chase Hatch. He was the 17th mayor of Camas, serving from 1940 through the end of 1941. He was born in Vernal, Utah, and died in Salt Lake City and was buried in Sandy. He married Hazel Colt in Salt Lake City in 1924. He moved to Camas sometime between 1935 and 1937. It isn't exactly clear. He seemed to be a jack of all trades, as at various times he was a smelter operator, a fish and game officer, which some of you may have, if you're old enough, ran into him if you were fishing illegally, a certification owner, and a grain dealer.
You have to listen
He
carefully.
was heavily involved in the Camas Valley Lions Club, serving as secretary for several years. In 1938, Sisson and Douglas Simpson served as the first chairman of Camas Valley Yesterdays. In 1939, Sisson won the mayoral election 111 to 76 over Frank Fitzgerald. For several years, Sisson was in charge of the sunrise services held at Mirror Lake on the last day of Yesterdays. Some of you may remember that. The service began at 6:30 a.m. and featured a patriotic program followed by a free breakfast provided by the Lions Club. This tradition continued through Hatch's time in office, but in 1941 or 42, it ended for several years due to World War II. A couple stories or newspaper articles identified some of Sisson Hatch's mayoral accomplishments. Like many small towns during the Depression era, Camas took advantage of the government program of improvements offered through the alphabet soup legislation of FDR. The WPA, or Works Progress or Project Administration, provided funding under the direction of Mayor Hatch to install 6,000 linear feet of curb and gutter, as well as sidewalks along Camas's Main Street. The State Road Commission also agreed to oil or pave the street between the curbs and gutter. The oil in question was probably a layer of liquid asphalt, not quite what we have the asphalt roads today. As you can see in this article from the Wasatch Way, they felt that Camas will take its place as one of the most modern, smaller communities in the state with the completion of this road project. So now we'll talk about Oakley. Oakley was incorporated in 1934, though the first work for it started in 1931. And this is a bit of a long story, so stick with me. But Oakley's decision to incorporate is interesting. In 1931, Ida Merle Franson was the president of the Oakley School PTA. She ran into Annie Olson, the PTA secretary, one day and discussed what should be presented at the upcoming PTA meeting. The two decided to discuss a community water system, as all PTA organizations do. The principal of the Oakley Elementary School had his students write an essay on the advantages of a community water system. And the two best essays were read by the authors at the January 5th, 1931 PTA meeting. The discussion at the PTA meeting led to the appointing of a committee to investigate possible water sources and feasibility. The committee was Robert B. Frazier, chairman, Reed Stevens, William Tryon, and Warren M. Frazier as members. Another committee, the Finance Committee, was created at the next PTA meeting. Curtis Walton was chosen as chairman, Eugene Horton and Ela Franson as members. They were instructed to visit every home in town and assess a fee of $1 per family to start the water system. Merle and Annie ended up, as most projects are done by the women, ended up doing the visiting and begging. One man told them that when or if the water ever got to his house, he would pay twice the required assessment, and then he would build a golden water fountain on Main Street. There's no report on the double assessment, but there's never been a golden fountain on Oakley's Main Street. So. The Finance Committee collected $53 from roughly 80 to 90 homes, which was enough to pay for testing of water samples. The lab tests came back showing that the water was one of the purest samples tested in the state laboratories up to that time. And there's a little
Joke.
to go along with that. Those of you that have been here long enough to remember Oakley Marvin. On December 10th, 1931, a water filing application was accepted and the town was given 2 years to complete the system. This was later extended to 2 additional years. On the advice of an attorney, the project was taken out of the hands of the PTA invested in the Water Committee until the town could be incorporated. Incorporation happened on January 5th, 1934, with the following Board of Trustees, as they call early city councils. Robert B. Fraser, President, Warren M. Fraser, William Tryon, Ela Franson, and Annie Olson as trustees. While Annie Olson was actually the clerk of the board, she was also a voting member. She must have been one of the first women to vote on a city council in Summit County. It would take the town until 1958 to pay the original loan, which was granted under the Public Works Administration, which was another part of the New Deal legislation of the Depression era. So Robert B. Fraser was the first mayor of Oakland. Happens to be my great-grandfather. Robert B. Fraser was elected as the first mayor, or selected, I should say, not elected. He served for just less than 2 years. Robert was born in Rockport, the town of Rockport, before flooded, in 1888, and died in Oakley in 1968. He's buried in Oakley. Robert married Agnes Ann White in 1911. The couple operated a dry goods store for most of their working lives, though Robert was a school teacher for several years. Together they owned and operated the Weaver Mercantile in Oakland, now known as Ken's Cash. Robert resigned just before his term ended to serve as a postmaster in Oakland. He was replaced by Warren M. Fraser, known to everyone as Tuck. Now, as you notice, that same last name, Warren or Tuck, was actually Robert's uncle. So Warren Monroe Fraser was the second mayor of Oakley. He was a member of the initial Oakley Town Council and was appointed mayor when Robert Fraser resigned. Warren was born in Wanship in 1862 to Thomas Leonard, who we mentioned as the fence viewer who was murdered, and Rachel Maxfield Young Fraser. He was the seventh of 10 kids born in the family. In 1895, he married Emma Kinsey in Heber City. The couple were unable to have children of their own, but did help raise a niece. While Tuck was not the first mayor of Oakley, he did end up with the responsibility of guiding the town through much of its initial organization. The first 2 years as a town were spent securing funding and bids for the water system. Much of the other town business was set aside until this initial project was off the ground. Therefore, Tuck was left with the responsibility of establishing the early ordinances and rules to govern the town. In his 6+ years serving as mayor, Tuck helped the town council create ordinances governing beer sales, which meant no sales at dance halls, no sales after 11:30 at night, and no sales to anyone already intoxicated. They also set fees for dog licensing, business licensing, agreements with Utah Power and Light, and the water rates. This was all taking place against the backdrop of the continuing Great Depression and the start of World War II. Tuck Fraser was elected to 3 consecutive 2-year terms and passed away just 4 short months after leaving office. He's buried along with his wife in the Oakley Cemetery. Finally, for Oakley, we'll talk about Wallace Elmo Wilson, who many of you probably knew. He was the 9th and then again the 11th mayor of Oakley, serving from 1960 to 1965, and again from 1970 to 1985. About 23 years, and he is, to this point, the longest serving mayor Oakley has had. Elmo was born in Marion in 1909 to Royal Walter and Hazel Leonard Wolstein. He was the oldest of 8 children. In 1930, He married Eva Horton, and they had 11 children together. Achievements noted as while he was mayor, they built 2 water tanks for culinary water that were 100,000 and 250,000 gallon capacity. He started a community beautification committee. The sewer system and the water system were updated or installed. The town building, or a town building, which is now Cattleman's Hall, was erected on the site of the old school. The rodeo grounds were moved and new bleachers and chutes built. The old church house was purchased and turned into the town hall. A new fire station was built. The July 4th rodeo was turned from amateur to or semi-professional to PRCA professional level. Elmo passed away in 1994 and is buried in the Oakley Cemetery. Now to Francis. As I said, we're a little shaky on some of this. So if any of you know Francis city history, let us know. It was incorporated in 1939. The reason for Francis's incorporation was much the same as Oakland's, water. Francis went about it differently with no PTA involvement. Families were using wells or the irrigation canals for household water needs at this time. Government grants were needed to help fund the installation of a citywide system, so the answer was to incorporate. The town was incorporated on December 28, 1939, and J. Clyde Van Tassel was the first president or mayor. See a relative? Okay. And you can probably tell us more about what he did as mayor, but the additional council members were Amos W. Prescott, Chancey McNeil, H. Roy Atkinson, and John A. McNeil. Due to World War II and then other unforeseen issues and delays, the water system was delayed. According to Ralph Prescott's calendar, the water system wasn't finished and turned on until August 1964. So it took them a while.
24 years.
J. Clyde Van Tassel was selected, he wasn't elected, but selected by the county council for the last couple days of 1939 and at least 1940. He was the first mayor, and he was born in Woodland in 1892. He died in Heber City in 1966. He's buried in Francis, and he married Ethel Prescott in 1914. In every census that has been released so far, he was listed as a farmer. John Walter Walt Prescott was mayor from 1964 to 65. Walt Prescott was born in Francis in 1897. His parents were James and Sarah Case Prescott. He married Emily Leon Louder in 1916, and together they had 7 children. Walt passed away in 1973 while living in the state of Washington, but his body was brought back and he's buried in Francis. It was Walt who was the mayor that was able to finish the culinary water system for Francis and get the long, difficult project wrapped up. Although it was finally finished, Francis would be plagued with water issues for many years to come, as there was just not enough water on the bench for the town's needs. The Summit County Bee is littered with comments about the need for additional water for Francis throughout the 70s, 80s, and part of the 90s. Okay, Ray Prescott was mayor of Francis for at least 1997. She was one of those people that was on the town council when a mayor resigned and she was appointed to finish the term. And Ray Prescott was born Berta Ray Bailey in 1943 in Salt Lake City. She was the 6th of 12 children. When Ray was a teenager, she and her family moved to Camas. It was in Camas while in high school that she fell in love with, as she told it, the student body president, who was the cutest, most popular boy in school. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, he was.
He was, okay. Pat and
Good to know.
She married that student body president, Jack W. Prescott, on November 23rd, 1960, in Memphis, Tennessee, while Jack was serving in the United States Marine Corps. Ray was outgoing, friendly, generous, and very involved with family activities, as well as community events. She considered everyone a friend. At one point, she invested in a police scanner just to stay up to date on the town happenings. She served on the Francistown board and as mayor of Francis City for only a short time. But they included her because she was and to this day remains the only female mayor of any town in Camas Valley.
We need more female mayors. Just put the word out, please.
Ray, having lived a full life in Camas Valley with many friends and family, passed away just a little more than a year ago on January 11, 2023. So, what comes next for us? We are going to repeat this presentation on Monday, because we know how hard Saturdays are, but 7 p.m. here at the library. During Camas Fiesta Days in July, you can find our second annual wagon tour, historic wagon tour of Camas on the calendar. It's the 27th, I believe, at 9 a.m. to 11. So we'd love to see you there. If you'd like to stay informed of our activities, please sign up on the sheet that's at the back table at the end of the presentation. And please, if you have additional information on anything we've covered or anyone, let us know. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And one final note, we do want to give Suzanne Gillette with Francis City a big thank you. She went through, when we asked them for a list of mayors, she took the minutes home and went through them as well as she could on her own time and gave us as complete a list as she could make. But she did mention that the early Francis government was pretty much run out of each mayor's home and not all the records survived that. So we do want to thank her for her time and effort. Yeah, and if there's any questions, you can ask now or you can talk to any of us after, but thank you for coming.